Hey everybody, Ryan here at eTrailer. Today on our 2023 Chevy Trailblazer, we're going to be showing you how to install the Demco Air Force One supplemental braking system. Before we do that though, let's take a couple minutes, check it out, and make sure it's going to work for you. Before we jump right in, I figured it'd be a good idea to touch base on the main parts that we're going to need to flat tow our Chevy down the road in the first place. And usually we like to be hooked up to the motorhome and really give you a good visual, but thunderstorming outside today, so bear with us. But there's going to be 5 main parts. First one is your base plate, all right, and that's going to give us a attachment point. That way we can hook our tow bar up to it. So the tow bar will plug into the ends here, and that'll be the actual link that connects the front of your Chevy to the back of your motorhome. The third thing that you're going to need is tow bar wiring, and you're going to have a cable that'll plug into the front of your Chevy and go to the back of your motorhome. And that's going to transfer all the lighting functions from the back of your RV to the back of your Trailblazer. The fourth main part will be safety cables, and so those are going to attach to the base plate and then attach to your motorhome's hitch. And in the event of an unlikely disconnect, they're going to keep everything paired together. And last but not least, the fifth main part for the Chevy will be a supplemental braking system. And what this is going to do is apply the brakes in your Chevy whenever you hit the brakes in your motorhome, helping to bring you to a more complete and controlled stop. One of the really nice things with this particular system is the fact that it is proportional. So more or less what that means is however hard you apply the brakes in your motorhome, that's how hard the brake pedal is going to be pulled down in your Trailblazer. And so it just makes for a better braking experience. You kind of know what to expect, so to speak. Everything's slowing down as a whole cohesive unit, as opposed to, you know, if you had settings wrong or something on a different style of braking system, you know, the car might want to kind of brake too hard and drag behind the motorhome or not brake hard enough. So with a kit like this, you plug everything in and there's nothing to worry about. You're going to get that optimal braking performance. This particular kit is going to have an indicator light that'll go on the back of your rear view mirror. And so what happens when the brake pedal is applied in the vehicle, so say if you hit the brakes, that light will illuminate. So you can kind of keep an eye on things, you know, making sure that everything's actually working. If you would rather be able to see that from inside of your motorhome, there's a kit. It's pretty much exactly the same as this, but it comes with what's called a wireless coach link monitor. And so what would happen, it pretty much takes that indicator light and comes in a little monitor that you put inside of your motorhome. You plug it into a 12-volt cigarette outlet, and you can see the light that way. So you know, if you really want to keep a good eye on things, or you don't have a great observation camera on the back of your motorhome, that's always another option for you. With the Air Force One too, it's pretty nice. There's a lot of different variations of this kit, so to speak. So you can kind of grow into it regardless of your situation. So let's say eventually you get a new motorhome, right? And you end up keeping your Trailblazer to tow. You can pick up just the motorhome side of things to get the motorhome equipped, that way you can hook up. Or let's say if you end up getting a new car or a second car that you want to flat tow, there's those kits available as well that for just the vehicle side of things. So just about any scenario, even some of the more late model coaches now are coming equipped from the factory with the Air Force One parts on the motorhome already. And so there's even kits available like that too. So you can get just the vehicle side set up, and you get your special hose here that connects everything. So regardless of what you got going on, or even what you really plan on doing in the future, you're going to be able to make something work. As far as the installation goes, you know, it's not too bad. It's never a ton of fun getting underneath the motorhome and working on it. The vehicle side's pretty straightforward, but you know, it's something that you have to do one time, and then from there, you're good to go. You know, super easy to set up, super easy to use, and extremely reliable. So a little bit of work is well worth it, at least in my opinion. But if you'd like to hang around, we'll go ahead and get started on it now. To begin our installation on our vehicle side, I figure we just lay out some of the main components here that we're going to be using. And on our car, I got the whole fascia and everything off too, because we're doing this at the same time that we're doing our base plate, which is what I suggest. You just have a lot more room to work and everything, but it can be done with the front fascia put back together and whatnot. So we're gonna have several components. So this is gonna be the breakaway switch. This will get mounted to the front of the vehicle, usually on the base plate. This is our air fitting here for the air to come into the system. Again, mounted up on the front. I usually end up putting these pretty close to each other, but every vehicle's a little different. Our main operating unit here. This usually finds a home somewhere in the engine compartment, which I got a couple ideas for this vehicle, so that's probably where it'll end up going. And we have an indicator light. All right, this will get stuck to the back of the rear view mirror. These wires will run down and get hooked up in the floorboard. And then our actuator cylinder. So this is going to clamp to the brake pedal arm, and this is what's actually going to be responsible for applying the brake in our vehicle. Starting at the front, I went ahead and mounted up our breakaway switch and our air fitting. And with these, it's pretty straightforward. Our breakaway switch just bolted to the tab that was already attached to our base plate. A lot of base plates are going to have an attachment point there. So just nut and bolt. And then for our air fitting, I just got a piece of scrap metal, just a little L bracket, bolted, the fitting to the bracket, and then bolted the bracket to the tab on our base plate. So not really a whole lot to it. And then I also just spray painted these items black just to kind of make it look a little bit better and help it blend in. So while we're right here, it's a good opportunity to run your orange and black wire from the breakaway switch as well as the airline tube. So there's the airline tube. Now you get a big bundle of it. I just dropped it down from the engine compartment. I'll show you the path I took in a minute. But this is actually going to get plugged into this fitting here. All right, so I'm just going to kind of eyeball the length there. And when it comes to these air fittings, this is going to hold true for all of them. You want a good, clean, straight cut. So you want to use a tool like this, a tubing cutter. I've taken a block of wood and a razor edge before and cut straight down on it. So you want the cut to look something like that, where it's good, clean, straight cut. That way it doesn't leak. If you use a regular pair of snips, it'll usually kind of kink it and end up leaking. But the way these plug in, they're quick connects. So they literally just kind of snap right into place. You'll feel it lock in, and that's all there is to it. And when you're routing this stuff, try not to put a sharp bend in it, kink the line or anything. But with that said, our breakaway switch wires and our airline tubing, they're just going to run through here, and everything's loose right now. Once it's all done, we'll secure it up. These are going to run over to here. We'll just let our breakaway switch wires kind of set here for the time being, and the airline tube is just going to run straight up behind our headlight into the engine compartment. So in the engine compartment, here's where our airline tubing comes up, and I'm just going to kind of let that bundle hang there for now. And now would be a good time to figure out what we're going to do with our operating unit. So before we put this in though, we can do a little bit of prep on it. Since our vehicle has electric assisted brakes and the battery gets disconnected, what you can do, they give you this rubber vacuum line, cut off a couple inch piece of it, and they give you this plug here, this cap. You want to insert that, and then that's going to go directly on this vacuum port here. And then this exhaust port, we're actually going to need to plug that. That's how they want it set up. So they give you this little rubber cone deal. You can put that in there. And then this acorn nut is going to thread on. Just make sure you get that going straight. And just snug it down with an 8mm socket. I was able to get our operating unit mounted up here, and we're on the driver's side. I just mounted it to our core support using some self-tapping screws. There is kind of a little lip here, so I just used some spacers that I had laying around. You can always just put regular washers behind there, you know, to kind of fill that void if you need to, but pretty tight. Not a whole lot of places to go with this, but it turned out really good. It's solid, and even on the bottom side, I was able to manage to put another support bracket, which we can see a little bit better from the other side here. Here's that support piece that I used, and we actually carry this little bracket. It's for a transmission cooler, like universal mounting kit, but it worked out real good because you can bend it. Just secured it to the bottom of the unit and ran a self-tapping screw in just to give it a little extra stability. From there, that airline that we ran up here, you can cut that to length, like I showed you before, and that is just going to get plugged into the fitting, the quick connect fitting on our operating unit labeled air in. You're going to have two black wires coming off of the main operating unit. One is going to get connected to ground, the other to the breakaway switch. Doesn't matter which one as long as you got them both hooked up. So I got one of them coming from our operating unit, and this is going to be the ground. And what I'm going to do at the same time, this is just maybe a 3 or 4 foot piece of extra wire that I had laying around that we're going to use for another ground here in a little while. So might as well kind of take care of both of them. So with this extra piece of wire, I'm going to strip the insulation back and twist it up. And then I'm going to twist those two ends together like that. And I'm going to take a ring terminal, slide it over those ends, crimp it down, and where I'm going to ground this is right here on this factory stud there. So I'll remove it with a 10mm. Take a ring terminal, slide it over the stud, and then just tighten this back down. What we can do now, so this is the other black wire from our operating unit, right? And I just dropped it straight down to the front of our car. And we can take a butt connector, since these ends are pre-stripped already, put that right over and crimp it down. And that's going to get connected to the black wire on our breakaway switch. So we'll strip this back. Give it a twist here. Grab our butt connector, place that in, get it crimped. And since I'm using heat shrink style butt connectors, the ones that come with the kit will work fine. Just I recommend taping them up real good, but you can always upgrade to these. The ends will seal up, so we'll come back with our heat gun and get that done. For our orange breakaway switch wire, this is going to have to get connected to power. Battery power, so the wire fell a little short. I just had a red wire that I used to extend it, so I just used our butt connector, ran that wire right up where all of our other stuff goes into the engine compartment here, and for the time being, we'll just kind of let this sit tight and move on to our next step. So now that I have our other components installed on the front of our vehicle, we can get our fascia back on. So essentially we'll just take your time. This will go back on the opposite way that we removed it. Get everything lined up. Make sure everything is coming through. And we'll just work it back into position here. So I was able to get our fascia reattached without any issues. It was kind of a tight fit, so just take your time working it around everything. I did have to cut out, a small little opening here to allow our airline fitting to pass through, but you'll probably only run into this if that's the type of braking system you're going to use. If you just have a standard breakaway switch without a fitting, you probably won't need to cut that because it'll pass through on the bottom. And then something I noticed too on our base plate where the little brackets come through to bolt up your connector, they were up too high, so our plug was wanting to hit. So if that happens, what you can do is just take a socket, small socket, an extension, put it over those little bars, and you can kind of bend them down to angle and lower the connector plug to get that back on without any interference. So what I've done with our red wire is strip the insulation back, and then you're gonna get maybe like a 5 or 6 foot piece of brown wire that comes in the kit. Strip that back and tie them 2 ends together, put them in one end of the butt connector, right? Get it crimped down. And then you can take your included fuse holder, put that end into the butt connector, and then make sure your fuse is not installed just yet. We'll do that at the very end once everything's hooked up on our car. But on the other end, crimp on a ring terminal, and you need to put it to battery power, so I just use this stud here. I remove the nut with a 13mm socket, put the ring terminal over it, and then tighten it back down. Moving on, we'll grab our new piece of airline tubing, cut it clean, and this one is going to get plugged into our operating unit where it's labeled air out. And this will run inside of the vehicle along with a couple of other things. So we've got our airline tube that needs to go inside, that brown wire that we just hooked up to power, that's going to need to run inside. So those kind of just loop around here. And then if you remember that extra black wire that we hooked up to our ground, that's going to run inside as well. So these all kind of drop down, and it might be a little tricky to see, but along the firewall there's a grommet that you can use to pass all these wires and tubing through. So let's go inside and check that out. Inside, we're on the driver's side, and here's where our wires and our tubing came through, just to kind of give you a better visual there. With that grommet, there's going to be almost like a rubber nipple on it, and you can cut that nipple off, and that'll open it up to allow you to actually get these wires and tubing through. And if they're getting kind of a hard time pulling them through because they're wanting to get stuck, you can always spray a little soapy water on them, and that seems to help be able to pull everything through. At this point, we can work on our indicator light here. So the actual light has some 2-sided sticky tape on it, and we're just going to peel that off, and then we can stick it to either the back of our mirror, or I'm probably going to do this little plastic piece, this little housing around it. And so make sure it's clean and pretty straightforward here. We'll go ahead, stick that to the bottom side of it, and then I'm going to route our wire to where it's going to drop down on our driver's side floorboard, and I'll show you how I did that once I have it done. Started to get our wire in, and what I did, you can kind of just peel down on this plastic piece and tuck that wire in behind it, and essentially just follow the headliner. You can pull down on it a little bit, kind of jam that wire in there all the way across, and then when you get to this piece, this pillar, you can just grab it and it pops off, and tuck your wire in. So this airbag here, push that wire in behind the airbag, and once you get to that point, you can kind of just tuck the wire in and follow it all the way down here. About About at this point, you can take your weather stripping, and that just pops out, and use that gap there to run your wire all the way down. And I just kind of have it angling where it's going to drop out on our floorboard here. For now, we're just going to hook up the black wire from our indicator light. So I crimped on a red butt connector there to the end of it. And then the other side, we'll plug into that black wire that we ran inside of the vehicle here that's connected to the ground underneath the hood. So that will complete that circuit there. To get the remaining wires hooked up underneath here, that's going to require us to get our actuator cylinder hooked up, which I've done. And on this vehicle, had to get a little creative because our cylinder has an anchor that needs to get connected to something solid. And there's just not a whole lot of room in here to do that. And so what I ended up doing is built a bridge, kind of, essentially. And I just have a piece of angle iron. This is probably 3/16 thick and probably 1/2 inch by 1/2 inch. And it's about 1 foot long, and I just ran it from this side to the other side, used self-tapping screws to secure it, and then that allows us to anchor. So with this kind of sorted and giving us that attachment point for our anchor, can mount up the cylinder. So this is just going to clamp to your brake pedal arm. All right, so nothing really to it there. You want to get it up, high enough to where it's out of your way from your foot, but also low enough that way it'll have, good leverage. And so this is what I did about this area. And when you mount this, you want it to have a good straight shot, meaning the cable, you want it to be in line with the cylinder. And then whenever the brake pedal's pushed down, you want that cable to have a straight shot like that. And then you also need to make sure that the tension is correct. So when the brake pedal's just resting, you want that cylinder to have just a little bit of movement there. That way there's not tension on the brake pedal arm whenever you don't need any, so to speak. And so to accomplish that, on the anchor, there's a Allen head set screw, all right? And you can adjust it with a 4mm Allen key. And so you can loosen it up to pull more slack out, or take slack, or tighten it up rather, to find that spot. And then once you do, you can tighten down the set screw. And then I attach the anchor to our angle iron just using a nut and a bolt. Once the cylinder's set, that airline tube that we ran in here, you can cut that to length like we did the others, and then just plug it right into the quick connect fitting there. And then there's a reed switch, which is this piece, so there's a wire coming off of it, and this is what's going to get hooked up to the remaining wires that we had left undone just a moment ago. Here's the wire from our reed switch, and that ends up breaking off into 2 really small wires. You have a brown one from the reed switch. That's going to get connected to the brown wire that we ran inside here. And I just use these spade terminals just so I can undo them if I need to in the future for any reason, but a butt connector will work just fine as well. And then the blue wire from the reed switch, that is going to get hooked up to the red wire from our indicator light. So what we have left to do now, with everything hooked up, we can just take the included fuse, we'll place it into the holder, and then we can do a quick test on our vehicle side here. To do a quick test, what you can do, you're going to need to hook up to your motorhome. I happen to put air in our system. I got a tool that I kind of made to allow us to use shop air here. But with that said, hook up to your motorhome, get it running, get the hoses hooked up, and then you can pull the breakaway pin. And when you do that, your brake pedal should get pulled down and the indicator light should illuminate. With our vehicle all wrapped up now, you can always come back, clean up all the wiring and everything like that. And with this all sorted, we can get focused on getting our motorhome done now. To begin our installation on our motorhome here, we're going to be working just in front of the rear axle, and this can be done on the ground. You know, you don't have as much room to work, but it is definitely doable. We've done it quite a few times, but today figured get it up in the air on our lifts here. That way we can have a really good look at what's going on underneath. First thing we're going to do is mount up the tank, and worked out pretty well. There was a bracket kind of holding this valve in place, and the holes in it actually lined up with the holes on our tank bracket. And so I just removed the existing nuts, put the bracket and put the tank in place, and then tightened the hardware back down. Gives it a nice secure mounting location. Just above our tank, this is where all of our air lines are going to come into. And we need to identify the supply line and the metered air. All right, so our supply line is this big, thick, green air hose, and that's usually going to hold true for the majority of them. Like I said, everyone can be a little bit different setup, but so there's always going to be air pressure in this one as long as there's pressure in the system. The metered air, that's going to be this line right here. And what happens with the metered air is you're only going to get air pressure through this whenever you hit the brakes. So that's a quick way you can test it too. You know, you can unplug this line, have someone hit the brake. If air shoots out and then stops when you let off the brake, you know that's the metered air. So with that said, you want to make sure to, when you're getting ready to cut into these, completely empty the air system. You can just hit the brake pedal a bunch of times with the motorhome off and deplete all the air out of it. And then you also want to clean these hoses really good. So I just use some brake cleaner, some rubbing alcohol, and a rag. Get any potential grime or undercoating off. That way when we put our fittings in there, it's not going to leak. Now that we identified our metered and supply lines, we'll start with the metered air. And how you're going to make this connection is you're going to cut this hose. I try to find a spot that's kind of straight. And when you cut this, you want to avoid using a regular pair of snips because it'll kind of cut it funny and probably leak. So you want to use something like this, a regular razor edge if you can pull that off, or even they make tubing cutters that you can use. And you want the ends of the cut to be clean and straight. That way it will avoid leaking. So it looks like we're in pretty good shape here. I think that'll work. And these are just quick connect fittings. So you'll take the appropriate key, push that in, make sure it's seated in there all the way, and we're good to go. So I'm going to do that exact same thing for our supply line. Here's what the supply line looks like, and when you're pushing these in, you know, really put some force into it to make sure that that big air line is completely seated into the fitting. So what we can do now, the remaining ports on our T's, we can get lines plugged into there that will run to our air tank that we installed. So I got our other air lines hooked up here. So, you know, the kit comes with the big roll of smaller air line. Cut it clean just like the others, plugged it into the metered air. So that just loops around and gets plugged into this fitting right here on our air tank. The supply line works the same way, except that one is just going to get plugged into this fitting on our air tank over here. This fitting right here on this side of our air tank, I have the smaller air line from our supply. So the larger, you know, big green supply line that we teed into, this is where this that's where this air line is coming from, and it plugs into there on our tank. There's one more fitting left on our air tank, this one right here, and this is actually going to run all the way to the back of our motorhome where we have the fitting hooked up that'll hook up to the car. So just take the remaining length of air line that you got, cut it clean, plug it in, route that all the way to the back. With that said, when you're routing this stuff, make sure you avoid any hot or moving parts, and don't make any super sharp bends. You don't want to put a kink in it. At the back, this is where our line ran to, and I have it hooked up to the fitting. So with this, you can mount it wherever you feel is best. What we usually do is just run it right through the fiberglass here. It's just fine, you're not going to hurt it. Just drill a couple of holes, they give you some nuts and bolts, and bolt it right up to it. Cut your line to length, nice and clean, plug it right in. Now that we got everything hooked up, we put the motorhome back on the ground and we'll start it up, let full air pressure build, and that way we can check for any leaks. We got our system completely filled up, full of air pressure, and to come back underneath to check for leaks, usually it's pretty obvious if you have one. You'll hear it, but if you don't hear anything and you want to play it safe, which what I recommend doing, you can take soapy water and spray those fittings down, and if you have bubbles constantly forming steadily, then you know you have a leak there. All right, so I did that. We're all good. We don't have any leaks. But if you do happen to have a leak, get all the air pressure back out of the system, relieve it. And then with this quick connect fittings, you can unplug the lines, make sure the ends are real clean, wipe them down again. If you have to recut them straight, do that. Plug it back in and continue to fill it up and check it until you know you're leak free. And that'll finish up our look at and our installation of the Demco Air Force One supplemental braking system on our 2023 Chevrolet Trailblazer.